The desert night was silent, except for the scratch of pen on paper. Inside a captured British command vehicle, a German field marshal sat hunched over his personal journal, the flickering light of a single lamp casting shadows across his weathered face. His name was Erwin Rommel, and on this night in November 1941, the man they called the Desert Fox was doing something unusual. He was writing about fear. Not the fear of tanks, not the fear of aircraft, not even the fear of the British soldiers who had proven themselves far more capable than he had initially expected. No, Rommel was writing about something else entirely, something that had kept his men awake at night, that had turned seasoned veterans into trembling shadows of themselves, that had destroyed more of his precious Afrika Korps than any other weapon in the British arsenal. He was writing about the 25-pounder field gun. The British artillery, Rommel scrawled in his distinctive handwriting, is the real terror of the desert. Now, why would the most celebrated German general of World War II, a man who had crushed the French army in 6 weeks, who had sent the British Expeditionary Force scrambling into the sea at Dunkirk, who would soon capture the supposedly impregnable fortress of Tobruk, why would this man, this legend, be writing in his private journal about his fear of a single British weapon? The answer to that question reveals one of the most overlooked truths of the Second World War. It exposes a secret that military historians have whispered about for decades, but that the general public has never fully understood. It tells us something profound about the nature of warfare, about the difference between glory and survival, about why the weapons that win wars are rarely the ones that capture our imagination. And it begins not in the scorching sands of North Africa, but in the rain-soaked proving grounds of England, where a team of British engineers was about to create something that would haunt the dreams of German soldiers for years to come. Before I take you deeper into this story, I need you to do something. If you've ever wondered why some weapons become famous while others remain unknown, despite being far more deadly, if you've ever questioned what actually wins wars, then this story was made for you. Subscribe to this channel right now and share this video with someone who appreciates the untold truths of history. What you're about to learn will change how you think about military power forever. The year was 1935, and Britain was waking up to a terrifying reality. Adolf Hitler had risen to power in Germany. The Wehrmacht was rebuilding at an alarming pace. The storm clouds of war were gathering on the horizon, and the British Army was woefully unprepared. The artillery situation was particularly dire. Britain's field guns dated back to the First World War. They were heavy, slow to deploy, limited in range, and utterly inadequate for the mobile warfare that military theorists were predicting would dominate any future conflict. Something had to be done. The Royal Arsenal at Woolwich received urgent orders. Design a new field gun, make it versatile, make it mobile, make it capable of firing both high-explosive shells and armor-piercing rounds. Most importantly, make it quickly. The engineers at Woolwich faced an almost impossible task. Traditional artillery design was a slow, methodical process that could take years. They had months. The specifications called for a gun that could do everything: support infantry, engage enemy artillery, destroy fortifications, and even defend against tanks. No single weapon had ever successfully fulfilled all these roles. The lead designer was a man whose name has been largely forgotten by history, which is itself a tragedy given what he accomplished. Working with a small team of dedicated engineers, they made a decision that would prove revolutionary. Instead of designing a gun to fire a specific weight of shell, they would design the finest gun they could build and then determine what shell it could throw. This seemingly simple reversal of the design process changed everything. The result was a weapon that could fire a 25-pound shell, hence its name, to a range of over 13,000 yards. It featured an innovative split trail design that allowed for a remarkably wide traverse arc without having to reposition the entire gun. The breech mechanism was robust and simple, allowing well-trained crews to fire up to 8 rounds per minute in desperate situations. But the 25-pounder's true genius lay in something that doesn't show up in specifications or range tables. It lay in its reliability. The British Army had learned hard lessons about weapons that performed brilliantly in testing, but fell apart under actual combat conditions. The 25-pounder was designed from the start for the worst conditions imaginable. It was built to function in rain, in snow, in mud, in the choking dust of desert sandstorms. Its mechanisms were protected, its tolerances generous enough to accommodate dirt and grit without jamming. By the time war broke out in September 1939, the British Army had begun receiving 25-pounders in significant numbers. The gun would go on to see service on every front where British and Commonwealth forces fought, from the frozen wastes of Norway to the steaming jungles of Burma, from the rolling hills of Italy to the hedgerows of Normandy. But it was in the western desert of North Africa that the 25-pounder would truly earn its fearsome reputation. The North African campaign began almost as an afterthought. When Italy declared war on Britain and France in June 1940, Mussolini's forces in Libya posed an immediate threat to British-controlled Egypt and, more importantly, to the Suez Canal, the vital artery connecting Britain to its empire in the east. The initial Italian invasion was a disaster. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani's forces advanced cautiously into Egypt, then stopped and built a series of fortified camps. In December 1940, a much smaller British force under General Richard O'Connor launched a counteroffensive that shattered the Italian army. In 2 months of fighting, the British advanced 500 miles, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, and captured 130,000 prisoners. The 25-pounder guns had performed magnificently during this campaign, but their true test was yet to come. Because Adolf Hitler could not allow his Italian allies to be humiliated so completely, he was about to send someone to fix the situation. In February 1941, a German general stepped off a plane in Tripoli. He was 50 years old, of medium height, with a sharp, fox-like face and eyes that missed nothing. He had been personally chosen by Hitler for this mission, and he came with a reputation as one of the most aggressive and innovative commanders in the entire German military. His name was Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel, and within weeks, everything in North Africa would change. Erwin Rommel was not supposed to be a legend. He came from a middle-class family with no military tradition. His father was a schoolteacher, his mother the daughter of a local government official. In the rigidly aristocratic German officer corps, where noble bloodlines and family connections determined advancement, Rommel should have been destined for obscurity. But Rommel possessed something that no amount of aristocratic breeding could provide. He had an almost supernatural instinct for battle. During the First World War, young Lieutenant Rommel had earned Germany's highest military honor, the Pour le Mérite, for a series of audacious assaults in the mountains of Italy. He had led a small force to capture over 9,000 Italian soldiers and 81 guns in a single action, personally leading from the front, driving his exhausted men through seemingly impossible terrain to strike the enemy where they least expected. Between the wars, Rommel had written a book about infantry tactics that became required reading at military academies around the world. He had caught the attention of Adolf Hitler, who appreciated his humble origins and his aggressive spirit. When the invasion of France began in May 1940, Rommel commanded the 7th Panzer Division. What happened next became the stuff of military legend. Rommel's division advanced so quickly, penetrated so deeply into enemy territory that the German High Command often lost track of where he was. They called his unit the Ghost Division because it seemed to appear and disappear at will, always striking where the enemy was weakest, always moving faster than anyone thought possible. Now, this ghost was in Africa, and he was about to receive his first lesson in the terror of British artillery. Rommel arrived in Tripoli with orders to stabilize the front and prevent any further British advances. He was explicitly told not to attack until he had received substantial reinforcements. The German High Command expected him to remain on the defensive for months. They clearly did not know Erwin Rommel. Within weeks of arriving, Rommel had sized up the situation and made his decision. The British forces were overstretched. Many of their best units had been withdrawn for the disastrous Greek campaign. Their supply lines were long and vulnerable. Most importantly, they did not expect the Germans to attack. Rommel struck on March 31, 1941. His forces swept forward, and the British began a retreat that would not stop until they were back on the Egyptian frontier. Within 2 weeks, Rommel had recaptured almost everything the British had won in their winter offensive. It was a masterpiece of mobile warfare, and it established Rommel's reputation as a military genius. But there were dark clouds in this moment of triumph, because during that lightning advance, Rommel's men had encountered British artillery for the first time, and what they experienced would shape the entire campaign to come. The German Afrika Korps was equipped with excellent weapons. Their tanks, particularly the Panzer III and Panzer IV, were well designed and mechanically reliable. Their 88mm anti-aircraft gun, pressed into service as an anti-tank weapon, would become legendary. Their infantry was well-trained and highly motivated. But German field artillery in North Africa was a chronic weakness. The standard German field gun was the 10.5 centimeters LEFH-18, a capable weapon, but one designed for the European theater. In the desert, it proved troublesome. The fine sand infiltrated its mechanisms, causing jams and misfires. Its range was adequate, but not exceptional. Most importantly, German artillery doctrine emphasized careful, methodical fire planning, which worked well in the deliberate offensives of the European war, but proved poorly suited to the fluid, fast-moving battles of the desert. The British, by contrast, had developed something remarkable. The 25-pounder batteries that accompanied their forces were equipped not just with excellent guns, but with an artillery system unlike anything the Germans had encountered. British artillery officers had learned painful lessons during the First World War about the limitations of artillery that could only fire on pre-planned targets. They had spent 20 years developing techniques for rapid, flexible fire support. Their forward observation officers were trained to call down accurate fire within minutes of spotting a target. Their gun crews practiced constantly until they could come into action with astonishing speed. More importantly, the British had developed the ability to concentrate the fire of multiple batteries onto a single target, creating devastating stonks that could obliterate anything caught in the open. A German unit that thought it was facing a single battery of 4 guns might suddenly find itself under fire from an entire regiment of 24 guns, or even a division of 72 guns. Rommel's first experience of concentrated British artillery fire came during the siege of Tobruk. This small port city had been bypassed during his lightning advance, and now it sat in his rear, a thorn in his side, tying down troops that he desperately needed elsewhere. The garrison, primarily Australian, had turned the city into a fortress and refused to surrender. In May 1941, Rommel launched a major assault on the Tobruk perimeter. His tanks broke through the outer defenses. His infantry surged forward. For a brief moment, it seemed that the fortress would fall. Then the 25-pounders spoke. The Australian gunners had registered every possible approach route. When the German attack came, they were ready. Shells crashed down on the advancing German infantry with terrifying precision. The tanks found themselves trapped in minefields under withering fire. Every time the Germans tried to bring up reinforcements, the British artillery observers spotted them and called down fresh barrages. The attack collapsed. Rommel lost over 1,200 men killed, wounded, or captured. More than 30 tanks were destroyed or disabled. It was his first significant defeat in Africa, and in his journal that night, he wrote bitterly about the effectiveness of the British guns. But this was only the beginning of his education. The Desert War settled into a pattern of attack and counterattack, advance and retreat, that would continue for nearly 2 years. Both sides fought across this same stretch of barren ground, capturing and losing the same towns and strongpoints multiple times. The names became legendary: Sidi Rezeg, Gazala, Bir Hakeim, El Alamein. Through all of this, the 25-pounder remained a constant presence. German soldiers came to recognize its distinctive sound: the sharp crack of the gun firing, followed by the whine of the incoming shell, followed by the devastating explosion. They learned to fear the British artillery observers, who seemed to be everywhere, calling down fire on anything that moved. What made the 25-pounder particularly terrifying was its versatility. German tankers learned to dread the armor-piercing rounds that could penetrate their vehicles at ranges where they thought they were safe. German infantry discovered that digging a foxhole was no guarantee of safety when shells were bursting in the air above them, showering deadly fragments into their positions. German vehicle crews found that even a near miss could disable a truck or half-track, leaving them stranded in the merciless desert. Let me pause here and ask you something. Throughout history, the weapons that capture our imagination are usually the dramatic ones: the tanks, the aircraft, the warships. But what really wins battles? Is it the weapons we celebrate or the ones we forget? Think about that for a moment and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious what you believe. The summer of 1942 found Rommel at the height of his powers. He had finally captured Tobruk in June, taking 35,000 prisoners and vast quantities of supplies. Hitler promoted him to field marshal, making him the youngest man to hold that rank in the German army. The road to Egypt seemed open, and Rommel drove his exhausted troops forward, chasing the retreating British toward the Nile. But the British were not defeated. They were falling back to a position that would become one of the most famous battlefields in military history: a narrow strip of desert between the Mediterranean Sea and the impassable Qattara Depression. The name of this place was El Alamein. The First Battle of El Alamein, in July 1942, was a desperate, confused affair. Rommel tried to break through before the British could consolidate their defenses. The British, reinforced with fresh troops and supplies, held on by their fingernails. Both sides suffered heavily. Throughout this battle, the 25-pounders performed heroically. Gun crews fired until their barrels were almost too hot to touch. Forward observers stayed in their positions under intense fire, calling down artillery support that broke up German attacks just when they seemed about to succeed. The British lost guns to enemy action and mechanical failure, but fresh batteries were rushed forward to replace them. Rommel wrote extensively about this period in his personal papers. He was frustrated, exhausted, and increasingly aware that something was fundamentally wrong with his campaign. His supplies were insufficient. His tanks were wearing out. His men were sick and tired. But again and again, he returned to the subject of British artillery. "The enemy's artillery is his strongest asset," Rommel observed. "We must do everything possible to neutralize it." But neutralizing British artillery proved nearly impossible. The 25-pounder's mobility meant that batteries could relocate quickly, disappearing before German counter-battery fire could find them. The British system of observation and fire control meant that German attempts to mass their forces for attacks were almost always detected and disrupted. The sheer volume of fire that the British could produce was staggering. Rommel began to calculate the mathematics of artillery warfare. A single 25-pounder battery, firing at a sustained rate, could put down 48 rounds per minute on a target. A regiment of 24 guns could deliver 192 rounds per minute. A division's worth of artillery could produce over 500 rounds per minute of concentrated, accurate fire. These numbers were terrifying. A German infantry company caught in the open by such a barrage would be annihilated within minutes. An armored formation might lose half its vehicles before it could even engage the enemy. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical damage. German soldiers who had survived artillery bombardments often spoke of the experience in terms that approached the mystical. One German officer, captured later in the campaign, described the experience to his British interrogators. You hear the first shell, and you think, I can survive this. Then the second shell comes, and the third, and they keep coming, and they are all around you, and the earth is shaking, and the air is full of fragments, and you cannot think, you cannot move, you can only pray. And then, if you are still alive when it stops, you are no longer the same man. Something has been taken from you that you will never get back. Rommel was not immune to these pressures. In his private letters to his wife, Lucy, he increasingly spoke of exhaustion and frustration. He complained of headaches and stomach problems. He criticized his Italian allies, his German superiors, and the impossible logistics situation that left his forces perpetually short of fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles. But he also kept returning to the British artillery. They have mastered the art of bringing down fire, he wrote. Our men call it Tommy fire. It haunts their dreams. The German attempts to counter British artillery were largely unsuccessful. They tried counter-battery fire, but the 25-pounders moved too quickly and too often. They tried air attacks on artillery positions, but the British had learned to disperse and camouflage their guns effectively. They tried to close quickly with the British positions before artillery could be brought to bear, but the forward observers were too good at spotting these movements and calling down fire. What Rommel faced was not just a weapon, but an entire system. The 25-pounder was the centerpiece of British artillery power, but its effectiveness depended on a web of supporting elements: trained observers, reliable communications, skilled gun crews, effective command structures, and a doctrine that emphasized flexibility and speed. The Germans had nothing comparable. Their artillery traditions emphasized deliberate fire planning, careful ammunition conservation, and centralized control. These practices had worked well in the European campaigns where the Germans held the initiative and could choose the time and place of battle. In the desert, where the front was fluid and situations changed rapidly, they proved inadequate. Meanwhile, British artillery doctrine continued to evolve. The commanders in North Africa developed new techniques for concentrating fire across larger areas. They perfected the creeping barrage, a moving curtain of fire that advanced just ahead of attacking infantry, suppressing enemy positions until the very moment that the attackers arrived. They learned to coordinate artillery with armored forces, providing immediate fire support to tanks that encountered resistance. The 25-pounder crews themselves became incredibly skilled. Many batteries had been in continuous action for months. The gun layers could hit targets accurately, even when exhausted and dehydrated. The ammunition handlers moved with mechanical precision, keeping up a rate of fire that would have seemed impossible to peacetime planners. A veteran British artilleryman later recalled the rhythm of action during the desert battles. You didn't think anymore. You just did. Shell came back from the ammunition party. You slammed it into the breech. Gun fired. Recoil knocked you back. You opened the breech, caught the casing, threw it aside. Next shell was already waiting. Fire order came. You adjusted, fired again. On, until your arms were numb and your ears were ringing and you couldn't remember what silence felt like. This was the reality behind Rommel's journal entries about the terror of the desert. It was not a single shell or a single gun. It was the relentless, systematic application of overwhelming firepower, delivered by men who had mastered their craft through endless practice and bitter experience. By autumn 1942, the situation in North Africa had reached a crisis point. Rommel's August offensive at Alamein had failed, stopped by British defenses and, critically, by the devastating fire of massed 25-pounders that caught German armor in carefully prepared killing zones. The Afrika Korps had shot its bolt. Now it was the British turn to attack. The new British commander was a man as different from Rommel as could be imagined. Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery was cautious where Rommel was bold, methodical where Rommel was intuitive, systematic where Rommel was improvisational. He had taken command of the 8th Army in August 1942, finding a force demoralized by repeated defeats and desperate for leadership. Montgomery immediately set about transforming his army. He insisted on thorough training and careful preparation. He demanded overwhelming superiority in men and materials before he would attack. Most importantly, he built his battle plans around the one decisive advantage he knew he possessed: British artillery. The Second Battle of El Alamein, which began on October 23, 1942, would see the largest artillery bombardment in British history to that point. Montgomery had assembled over 900 guns, including hundreds of 25-pounders, along his attack front. The opening barrage was designed not just to destroy enemy positions, but to demonstrate, beyond any doubt, the overwhelming power that the British could bring to bear. At 9:40 p.m. on October 23rd, the guns opened fire. The sound was audible in Alexandria, 60 miles to the east. German and Italian soldiers who survived that night described it as like the end of the world. Shells crashed down in an unending torrent. The darkness was lit by thousands of explosions. The ground shook with continuous tremors. Men who tried to leave their positions were cut down by fragments. Men who stayed in their positions were buried alive as shells collapsed their dugouts. Rommel was not even in Africa when the battle began. Exhausted and sick, he had returned to Germany for medical treatment, leaving his army in the hands of a subordinate. When news of the British attack reached him, he flew back immediately, arriving on October 25th to find his forces already reeling. What Rommel found was a nightmare. His carefully constructed defensive positions were being systematically dismantled. The minefields he had laid, what he called his Devil's Gardens, were being breached by British engineers while artillery fire suppressed his defenders. His counterattacks, launched according to standard German doctrine, were being smashed by concentrated artillery before they could develop. In his journal, Rommel described the battle in apocalyptic terms. Rivers of blood were poured out over miserable strips of land which, in normal times, not even the poorest Arab would have bothered about, he wrote. The British threw in everything they had, and their artillery was overwhelming. The battle lasted 12 days. When it was over, the Afrika Korps was broken. Rommel began a retreat that would not stop until he reached Tunisia, over 1,000 miles to the west. Of the 104,000 Axis troops at El Alamein, 30,000 were killed or captured. Nearly all of Rommel's tanks were lost. Montgomery had achieved the first decisive British victory over the Germans in the entire war. Churchill would later call it the end of the beginning. And at the heart of that victory was the weapon that Rommel had come to fear more than any other. The 25-pounders at El Alamein fired more rounds in 12 days than many batteries had fired in years. Gun barrels wore out and had to be replaced. Crews collapsed from exhaustion and were spelled by reserves. Ammunition dumps that had taken months to build were emptied in hours. But the guns kept firing. Through the dust and heat of day, through the cold of the desert nights, through German counterattacks and air raids and everything else the enemy could throw at them, the 25-pounders maintained their relentless bombardment. A German prisoner captured during the battle was interrogated by British intelligence officers. When asked what had been the worst aspect of the fighting, he did not hesitate. "Your artillery," he said. "We could deal with your tanks, your infantry, your aircraft. But the artillery, there was no answer to it. It never stopped. It was always accurate. It was like fighting against a force of nature." This testimony was not unique. German prisoners throughout the North African campaign, and later in Italy and Northwest Europe, consistently rated British artillery as the most effective and feared element of the British military. These were not cowards or incompetents. They were soldiers from one of the finest armies in the world, veterans of campaigns across Europe. And they were united in their respect and fear for British guns. Rommel himself, in his famous book Infantry Attacks, and in his later writings on the North African campaign, returned again and again to the subject of artillery. He analyzed British techniques, criticized German inadequacies, and proposed reforms that were never implemented. His respect for the 25-pounder and the men who served it was genuine and hard-earned. "The British artillerymen," Rommel wrote after El Alamein, "are the finest in the world. Their fire control, their accuracy, their ability to concentrate overwhelming firepower in the shortest possible time. These are skills that we have not matched. Until we do, we will continue to suffer." These words, from the most celebrated German general of the war, are the ultimate tribute to the 25-pounder and to the men who served it. Coming from an enemy who had defeated British forces repeatedly, who had captured Tobruk when it was supposedly impregnable, who had driven the 8th Army back to the gates of Egypt, this praise carries weight that no amount of British self-congratulation could match. The story of the 25-pounder did not end at El Alamein. The gun would continue to serve throughout the remainder of the war and beyond, seeing action in Italy, Burma, Northwest Europe, and countless smaller campaigns. Wherever British and Commonwealth forces fought, the 25-pounder went with them. In Italy, the gun faced new challenges. The mountainous terrain made mobility difficult. German defensive positions were often constructed in solid rock, resistant to anything but the heaviest fire. The weather alternated between scorching summer heat and brutal winter cold, with rain and mud making movement nearly impossible for months at a time. The 25-pounder adapted to all of these conditions. Gun crews learned to manhandle their weapons up seemingly impossible slopes. New techniques were developed for engaging targets in defilade, hidden behind ridgelines and rock outcroppings. The gun's reliability proved invaluable in conditions that would have destroyed lesser weapons. One particular action in Italy demonstrates the 25-pounder's capabilities under extreme conditions. During the Battle for Monte Cassino in early 1944, a single battery of 25-pounders was tasked with providing fire support for an attack on a heavily fortified German position. The guns were positioned on a narrow mountain ledge with barely enough room to operate. Supply had to be brought up by mule train, as no vehicles could navigate the terrain. For 3 days, the battery fired continuously, supporting multiple infantry attacks against positions that seemed impervious to assault. The gun crews worked in rotation, exhausted men spelling each other while the fire never ceased. Ammunition consumption was so high that the mule trains could barely keep up. 2 guns had mechanical failures and were repaired under fire by their crews. When the position finally fell, the infantry found German defenders who had survived the bombardment in deep bunkers. Even these survivors were shattered, deafened, disoriented, in many cases mentally broken by the sustained artillery fire. The commanding officer of the British battalion involved said simply, "Without the 25-pounders, we could not have taken that position. It's as simple as that." Similar stories could be told from Burma, where 25-pounders supported the long, brutal campaign against the Japanese in some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. The jungle made observation difficult and mobility nearly impossible. The monsoon rains turned every position into a swamp. Disease claimed more casualties than enemy action. Yet the 25-pounder continued to perform. Gun crews developed new techniques for clearing fields of fire in dense jungle. Forward observers learned to call down fire on targets they could not see, using sound and experience to locate enemy positions. The gun's reliability became legendary. Weapons that had been submerged in rivers, buried in mud, and exposed to monsoon rains for months at a time continued to fire accurately. The final chapter of the 25-pounders' war was written in Northwest Europe, where it supported the liberation of France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and ultimately the invasion of Germany itself. Here, the gun faced its original intended environment, the mobile, fast-moving warfare of open country. The campaigns in Northwest Europe saw some of the largest artillery concentrations of the war. During Operation Goodwood in July 1944, over 2,000 guns, including hundreds of 25-pounders, fired on German positions around Caen in a bombardment that lasted hours. The noise was so tremendous that it was heard in England, across the Channel. German soldiers who survived these bombardments described them in terms similar to their comrades in North Africa. The overwhelming volume of fire, the accuracy, the seeming impossibility of escape, these themes recurred in prisoner interrogations and captured documents throughout the campaign. What made British artillery so effective in these campaigns was not just the quality of the guns, but the system that had been developed through years of hard experience. The lessons learned in North Africa about flexibility, about concentration of fire, about the importance of trained observers and reliable communications had been codified and taught to every artillery unit in the British Army. The result was an organization that could deliver devastating fire support under almost any conditions. Whether supporting infantry in the close country of Normandy, providing covering fire for armored advances across open ground, or conducting counter-battery fire against German artillery positions, British gunners had developed techniques that were unmatched by any other army. German commanders in the West echoed Rommel's earlier assessments. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, told his interrogators after the war that British artillery had been the most formidable weapon we faced. General Hans Speidel, who had served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa and later in Normandy, called British artillery consistently excellent, and noted that German units had learned to fear it above all other British weapons. These assessments might seem surprising given the attention that has historically been paid to other aspects of the war, to tanks, to aircraft, to the great naval battles and airborne operations. But they reflect a truth that military professionals have always understood. Artillery is the king of battle. Erwin Rommel did not live to see the end of the war. In July 1944, he was severely wounded when his car was strafed by British aircraft in Normandy. He was recovering at home in Germany when he was implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Given the choice between public trial and the execution of his family, or suicide and the safety of his loved ones, Rommel chose the poison capsule. He died on October 14, 1944, and was buried with full military honors as a German hero. But his writings survived him. His journal entries, his letters to his wife, his tactical analyses and operational reports, all of these became part of the historical record after the war. And throughout these documents, running like a thread through the fabric of his military thought, was his respect for British artillery and his recognition that it had been the decisive factor in his defeat. The British have mastered the use of artillery to a degree that we have not achieved, Rommel wrote in one of his final tactical assessments. Their 25-pounder is an excellent gun, but it is their system of fire control that makes them so dangerous. They can concentrate overwhelming firepower in minutes, and they can sustain it for hours. Against this, our troops have often been helpless. This assessment, from one of history's great commanders, raises questions that extend far beyond the specific context of the North African campaign. What makes some weapons decisive while others are merely useful? Why do some military innovations transform warfare while others are forgotten? What is the relationship between technology, doctrine, and human factors in determining the outcome of battles? The 25-pounder's success was not primarily technological. It was a good gun, but not necessarily better than comparable weapons in other armies. Its range, accuracy, and rate of fire were excellent, but not exceptional. What made it decisive was the system that had been built around it. The trained observers, the reliable communications, the flexible doctrine, the skilled gun crews who had honed their craft through years of practice and combat. In other words, the 25-pounder's success was fundamentally a human achievement. It required generations of military professionals to develop the techniques that made British artillery so effective. It required thousands of hours of training to produce gun crews who could maintain fire under the most extreme conditions. It required forward observers willing to risk their lives in exposed positions to call down accurate fire on enemy targets. Rommel understood this better than most. His own tactical genius was largely a matter of human factors, of leading from the front, of inspiring his men, of making decisions faster than his opponents. He recognized the same qualities in the British artillery arm, and he respected them, even as he struggled to overcome them. The 25-pounder remained in British service long after the war, fighting in Korea, Malaya, and other conflicts. The last were not retired until the 1960s, replaced by more modern weapons, but never forgotten by those who had served with them or against them. Today, a handful of 25-pounders survive in museums and private collections around the world. They are quiet now, their barrels cold, their breech mechanisms locked open. Visitors walk past them, perhaps reading the informational plaques, perhaps wondering what it was like to serve one of these guns in the heat of battle. They cannot know. They cannot feel the bone-jarring recoil, hear the deafening roar, smell the acrid cordite smoke. They cannot experience the exhaustion of sustained action, the fear of incoming fire, the fierce pride of hitting a target and seeing the enemy fall back. They cannot understand, truly understand, what Rommel meant when he called artillery the desert's real terror. But perhaps they can learn. Perhaps they can read the words of those who were there. Both the British gunners who served the weapons and the German soldiers who faced them, and begin to appreciate what was accomplished in those distant battles. Perhaps they can understand that wars are not won by famous generals or celebrated weapons, but by ordinary people who master their craft and apply it with skill and courage under the worst conditions imaginable. This is the lesson of the 25-pounder. This is what Rommel's journal entries really teach us. Not that one side was superior to another, but that excellence in any field requires dedication, practice, and a willingness to learn from experience. The British artillery arm was not born excellent. It became excellent through decades of professional development and years of combat experience. Its success was earned, shell by shell, battle by battle, life by life. Rommel, for all his defeats, would have understood and respected this achievement. He was a professional soldier who devoted his life to the study and practice of his craft. He recognized professionalism in his enemies, even when, perhaps especially when, that professionalism contributed to his defeat. In the end, the story of the 25-pounder is not really about a weapon at all. It is about the men who served it and the men who faced it. It is about what human beings can accomplish when they commit themselves fully to a task, whatever that task may be. It is about the terrible arithmetic of war. The shells fired, the casualties inflicted, the battles won and lost, and the human cost behind those numbers. Rommel called artillery the desert's real terror. But terror was not the whole of it. There was also skill, dedication, courage, and 1,000 other human qualities that made the 25-pounder effective. The gun was just metal and wood and rubber. It was the men who gave it meaning. And that, perhaps, is the real lesson for us today. Not about weapons or tactics or the distant battles of a war that ended nearly 80 years ago, but about what human beings can accomplish when they devote themselves to excellence. The 25-pounder crews did not set out to terrorize their enemies. They set out to do their jobs well, to serve their country, to protect their comrades. The terror was a byproduct of their professionalism. This is why Rommel's words still matter. Not because they tell us about a particular weapon or a particular war, but because they remind us that excellence in any field, military or civilian, public or private, requires the same fundamental qualities: dedication, practice, attention to detail, willingness to learn from mistakes, and the courage to perform under pressure. The 25-pounder is silent now. The men who served it are almost all gone, passed into the pages of history along with their enemies and their battles. But the lesson remains. Excellence is possible. Terror, in its truest sense, the respect and fear that comes from facing someone who has truly mastered their craft, is earned, not given. Rommel knew this. He wrote it in his journal, in the quiet hours of the desert night, when the guns were silent and he had time to think about what he had learned. The British artillery, he said, was the desert's real terror. He was right. And the reason he was right has nothing to do with guns and everything to do with the human beings who served them. Remember that the next time you see an old weapon in a museum, or read about a distant battle, or wonder what really decides the outcome of great events. It is not the machines. It is not the technology. It is the people. Their dedication, their skill, their courage, their humanity. That is what Rommel understood. That is what his journal entries really mean. And that is why this story still matters, 8 decades later. To anyone who wants to understand what human beings are capable of accomplishing when they commit themselves fully to a task. The desert's real terror was not a gun. It was the men behind the gun. And in the end, that makes all the difference. If this story has changed how you think about what really wins wars, share it with someone who deserves to know the truth. Subscribe if you haven't already. The stories history forgot are the ones that matter most.